I think in the packet that I have here, you're including recommendations, Chris. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off the meeting, go through the roll call, recognition of guests, approval of minutes. When we get to new business, I'll pass the ball to you, and then you'll have the handout, which would include the introductions. Does that work? All right.
Good to me. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Roll call, please.
Dr. Bofi is not in attendance. Mr. Castile, Dr. Davis, Ms. Holloway has a proxy, Mr. Garvey.
Here.
Mr. Morris.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, great. All right, I've got an item here for recognition of guests. I don't see any guests in the room. So if there's no exception, we're going to skip this item. So looking across the dais here, do I see any exception? Hearing none, we're going to the next item. Approval of minutes. Can I get a motion to approve minutes? Dr. Davis, a second. Mr. Garvey, thank you. Is there any exception to this motion? For August 31. All right, can we do these
In Globo.
in Globo? All right. All right. So is there any exception in Globo to approving these minutes? Hearing no exception, they're both approved. Going to the next item. New business. Can I get a motion for item 3.1, consideration of a review of the selected state growth models? Dr. Davis, second, Mr. Castile. Thank you. Chris, you have the ball.
Thank you, Mr. Morris, and thank you, everybody. I'll share my screen and ask to see if everybody's able to see that. People can see that okay. It would help me if we can leave it in this rather than going full screen, but hopefully this is you got enough real estate in the slides to be able to see that okay.
Looks like we're good on this end.
Okay, great. Let me just very briefly suggest how we'll spend our time today. Having completed the welcome and introductions, the first chunk, the first discussion will be we're going to follow up on an item from the last meeting, just to review some features of selected growth models, help us to understand what some of the alternatives are, and to stimulate a conversation about the strengths and weaknesses of those models. Following a break, we have more of an unstructured time to talk generally about growth model priorities. The idea, I hope, is that our conversations to date and for the first part of this meeting will help us to really kind of appreciate some of the pros and cons of different approaches. And we had talked in the previous meeting about really needing to clarify those priorities in order to provide some helpful feedback to the department. And then we can come for time for public comment if we have those that are interested in doing so. The next couple of slides are really just reviewing things that we talked about at the last meeting, but I think it'll help us get a little momentum into the conversation.
Hey, Chris, if you don't mind, my understanding is these meetings are live streamed, and I'd like for everyone to appreciate all the participants we have, in particular the subject matter experts. So if you would take us through those introductions, I'd really appreciate it. So that those viewing from home understand what we're doing here.
Yes, thank you for catching that. My name is Chris Domaleski. I'm the Associate Director at the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment based in Dover, New Hampshire. I have the pleasure of helping to coordinate this meeting. And I'll just call on the others so we have a little organization to the introductions. Dr. Sizek.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Sizek, Professor of Educational Measurement and Evaluation Emeritus at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.
Great, thank you. Dr. Russell.
Hi, I'm Mike Russell, a professor in the Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics, and Assessment program at Boston College.
Thanks, Mike. Dr. Honitz.
Hi, Christy Hovanet, Senior Policy Fellow at Excel in Ed.
And Dr. Don Francesco.
Hi, I'm Christine Don Francesco. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst and at the National Education Association. Thank you.
And I will take the privilege of introducing my colleague, Dr. Chris Brandt, who although not a member of the panel, is helping to coordinate and document these meetings. So I'm very grateful to Chris as well. So those are the members that you see here from the panel side. Mr. Morris.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to recognize Mr. Thomas Lambert, that's at the dais with board members. Mr. Lambert is representing LDOE on this project. So with that said, I'll pass the ball back to you, Chris, and let's go from there.
Great, thank you. At the October meeting, we spent some time talking broadly about some common approaches to growth. So Dr. Isaac, we know you weren't able to join us, but I suspect this is all very familiar to you. One of the things that we said is we'd like to unpack some of these in a little more detail, and that's part of what we're set up to do today. So I won't linger on this slide, knowing that we'll have a chance to talk about some of these models, particularly student growth percentile model, transition table model, and gain score models today, which are some of the more common growth models in use. And you see here, this is also a slide I presented at the October meeting, again, just to help us tune in to the topics that we talked about before and how we're picking up on them at this meeting. We noted that based on a review that the data quality campaign conducted in January 2019, these were the models in use by states for their accountability system. You'll note that some states use more than one model, which is why that number is larger than 50, if you sum the count column. And we also talked in general, and it's worth repeating, that these categories aren't always mutually exclusive. Some models really straddle categories. Again, some states use multiple approaches, some of which we'll talk about today. And some of these have been updated. I know just from looking at some states that some of this information has changed since 2019, because like Louisiana is doing now, review and revision of accountability is ongoing. We'll start with student growth percentiles. I think many of the panelists will know this, but this may be beneficial to the broad group, since this is the most prevalent of the growth models we see used in state SS systems. And I'll say this often, but I'll start by emphasizing it straight away, that the manner in which the model is implemented in the system matters a great deal. So just to say that a state uses SGP or value added doesn't always give us a lot of visibility into exactly how that model is functioning, which is why I hope I'll get a little bit of value from showcasing some of the two very distinct state approaches here in just a moment. But SGPs, like a lot of growth models, like value-added models, is a regression-based measure of growth, and it works by conditioning current achievement on prior achievement and then describing performance relative to students with identical prior achievement histories. Sometimes we call this academic peer groups. That term is used in value-added models as well. It just means any effort to create groups of similar students by way of, in the case of SGP's performance, we're talking about a VAM, we'd be talking about performance plus things like demographic factors. But the thing that many people know about student growth percentiles, and again, you don't need an SGP model to do this, is that you can describe performance with respect to percentiles. It's a familiar basis to interpret performance. So you can talk, for example, about a percentile of a child's growth at the pediatrician's office, which gives you a sense for whether growing 3/4 of an inch since the previous visit to the current visit is atypically high, or about average, or atypically low. I put this here in red. I think I've already made this point along the way. If you remove the covariates from value-added models, you get something very, very similar to an SGP. In fact, I think I said this at the last meeting. There are ways to specify all the models we're going to talk about so that they have very highly correlated results, which is why, again, I'll return to the point that the manner in which the model is introduced into the system makes a lot of difference. This is just an illustration. You can tell we've been using this. I should say my colleague here at the Center, Damien Wiedemanner, is the developer of student growth percentiles. You can tell that it's been implemented for a while, because this visual you can see uses data from 09 and 10. So it's been out there for a while. And I like this visual because it just really graphically shows what we mean by conditioning on prior performance. So here we see histogram for two different points in time. If you look at those contour lines, these black contour lines here. You can imagine that that's a histogram in 2009, in this case, beginning year, that you would care to illustrate this point. And it would show the distribution of student performance in that year on a state test. And then we would look at that's the performance in 2010 for that group of students. Again, we're conditioning on a single scale score, or in some cases, a very tight group of scale scores. And you can say, for example, all students who scored 600 in 2009, how did they do in 2010? And you can say, for example, this looks like a score at about 620. And say, well, that was, to reach that would have been at the 75th percentile for that academic peer group, or that group that was conditioned on a score of 600. Just a way of illustrating conceptually how student growth percentiles works.
So Chris, does this apply to all 5 models, or is this unique to one in particular?
This is, I think this is similar, although the statistics will be a little different to value-added approaches. Again, if you're only conditioning on prior performance, this kind of conditioning doesn't apply for gain score approaches or for transition table approaches that we'll talk about shortly. So as I noted, the way in which it's included in accountability, there's a lot of options. I thought we'd look at 2 options. Now, all the data that I'm bringing to you today is from publicly available data from these states. In some cases, I work with these states, but again, I didn't bring anything that you couldn't find on the web. I know some of my colleagues here on the panel work with these states as well. And so this may look familiar. So Illinois uses what I call a pretty pure norm reference version of student growth percentiles. And I'll say what that means in just a moment. Michigan uses more of a criterion reference or growth to standard approach that has student growth percentiles as the analytic unit. And this is where this is a good example of what I mean by these categories crossing with growth. So Michigan uses SGP, but I will also contend, and I'll explain why I say that in just a moment, why they also have a growth to standard approach. Some of my colleagues might have different perceptions about how I'm characterizing it, and I would absolutely welcome feedback and reports of you about this. So in Illinois, growth is weighted 50% for elementary and middle school. They don't use growth in high school in Illinois. And yeah, I debated how much detail to give you. They use what's called baseline SGPs in Illinois. The other alternative is to have a cohort-based SGP where that distribution is recalculated every year. In Illinois, they fix it to a baseline year, and those interpretations are always with respect to that year. And if that's something that we want to talk about more, I'm happy for us to do that.
So Chris, you mentioned that Illinois doesn't assess or consider growth in high school. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
They just so I didn't bring you the pie chart for high school, but high school has different indicators in it. So for example, graduation rate takes most of the weight that growth has in elementary school. And it's just a decision. Some states will, it's always complicated in high school because there's not always a single progression of courses in high school. Some students may take Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, Trig. Other students may take Algebra 1, Algebra 2, then Geometry. So some states solve that by just going from 8th grade to 10th grade. So there's just a lot of complications when it comes to how growth is done in high school. Doesn't mean it can't be done, doesn't mean there aren't good ways for it to be done. But Illinois is one of the states that doesn't calculate it in high school. They only use it for schools that cover 3 through 8.
I'd be, I don't know about other board members, but I'd be interested to understand what other potential approaches are used in high school if, if growth is not, part of the pie. Maybe you could bring that to us next time as a follow-up.
I'm happy to. The short answer is it's just much more status-based. So it means
Right, as opposed to growth, right?
Right. You're going to get much more of the weight coming from proficiency on state tests, graduation rate, and other things like in Illinois' case, chronic absenteeism, climate. It's just redistributing the non-growth indicators.
Our chronic absenteeism, 20%. That's interesting.
Chris, I have a question and observation. Is okay?
Of course.
So my first question is, you described Illinois' model as a norm reference use of SGPs. In what sense? Help me see the norm referencing.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in the next slide, but the short answer, Greg, is that they just use median SGPs, and they don't tether it to any adequate growth percentile.
Okay. I'll wait for the next slide also. Thank you for that. But in response to the question about high school, my speaker wasn't really capturing your audio well during your comment, but in my experience, and I'm not defending this or suggesting this, but in my experience, some states actually just do a longer leap between the conditioning year and the present year. So they might take an 8th grade math score as the conditioning variable for the high school geometry or something, we'll say. I think that has some concern, at least in my mind, the long gap between the two measurements to be used for growth. But that is another approach that I think people have done.
You're exactly right. I did mention that there's really one of two approaches. If a state gives what I'll call an end of domain test, meaning it's a statewide test, and grade 10 or 11 is what's most common, then growth from 8 to 10 or 8 to 11 would be the approach the state may take. Other states will use end of course tests. And the most common way to do that is to create pathways for the prevalent course sequencing. They'll say if most students go Algebra 1 to Algebra 2 to trig, then that's one pathway. If there's another sort of critical mass at a Algebra 1 geometry pathway, then that might be another growth trajectory. So there's multiple approaches. But yeah, and then students might skip a grade. You might have Algebra 1 in 8th grade and they don't take math again until 10th grade. So all of that has to be sorted out, and the state determines how growth is going to be computed.
And Chris, to do that, wouldn't you need a fairly large population of students potentially? Because every time that you're trying to change that pathway, you need a lot of kids in order to get a reliable indicator.
And then there's still going to be debate about how comparable growth is across those pathways. Good questions and discussion so far. So here's the point that Greg brought up, and I'm glad you did. So when you calculate SGPs, and again, you can do this with other growth models, but when you get this percentile, the most common thing to do is to get a median growth percentile for the group or for the school, as is included in the accountability system. So you can just report that median growth percentile, which theoretically is on a scale between 0 and 100, and that can be the unit that goes into the accountability model. I don't know if any states do that directly, but Illinois, like a lot of states, recognizes that the called the real or the observed range of scores for a school level growth is closer to like 30 to 70. And so what they did was they pick up, I'll call it a floor, in this case it's 28, ceiling, which is 73. They picked that so that's quote the real range in which school median growth percentiles reside. And then they scale that from 0 to 100. And that way, it's a recognition, particularly thinking about the top end of the scale. If a school is getting a median growth percentile north of 70, they're doing exceedingly well. And so it's almost indistinguishably different from, say, a 75 or an 80 or a higher value, because here we're talking about just a small percentages of schools that achieve those kinds of values because it's an aggregate statistic. So, but the big story, I'll be caught in the details, is that it's just a translation of the median growth percentile, and that's why I'm calling that strictly a norm reference interpretation.
So I understand the median growth percentile, but I'm not sure, it's clear to me, I'm not sure about other members on the on the dais here, have a clear interpretation of the graph. what the application would be. Looking for some acknowledgement from my colleagues here. Can you give me an example, Chris? Just make sure I'm clear here.
Hey, Chris, can I interject for 1 second? Chris, can you hear me?
Yeah, did you hear me? Yes, please, Mike, go ahead.
Okay, everyone was either standing still or frozen. Yeah, so in Illinois, Chris, if I understand correctly, effectively what they do is they start at that, the scale, there's basically two scales, right? There's the blue line is representing the possible median growth percentiles. And then that orange line is representing the points that schools are getting in the accountability system if their mean growth percentile falls, somewhere between 28 and 73, or potentially above or below. But really, those points on the graph, it looks like it's going from 28 to 71 or 73. But really, underlying that is another scale that's going from 0 to 100, which represents the number of points the schools are getting.
That's well said. Yeah.
I see the 28. I don't see the 73.
Yeah, it's saying that there's a point at which there's going to be a ceiling.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking on the wrong scale. I see it now. Yeah,
And
I was looking on the
so-
wrong scale. I got it now.
Yeah, maybe another way to express it is to say, if I get a distribution of student growth percentiles, it's what they call a uniform distribution. It's going to be a plateau. If I get a distribution of school median growth percentiles, it's going to be squished up. It's going to be a distribution that's kind of squished between 30 and 70.
Right.
And again, as we're
I-
summarizing things.
I
So what
got
we're
it now.
saying is we want to reward points in that dense or squished up region of the distribution.
I'm good. Looking across the dice here. Everybody's on board. Yep, we're caught up. Sorry about that.
But the big idea here is that it is norm reference. They don't do anything other than translate that median growth percentile. So the degree to which students are growing at a pace, and this is important because we want to talk conceptually about what we want to value in Louisiana. Whenever a student's growing at a rate that exceeds the rate of his or her academic peers, the school's going to get more points. The student's growing at a rate that's not on pace with his or her academic peers, they're going to get fewer points. And again, it's a different thing to say that a student's growing at a rate that exceeds his or her academic peers, and that student's growing at a rate that's good enough to reach proficiency in a reasonable amount of time. Two different questions. Again, we sort of acknowledged that last time, and I'll come back to that today. Michigan also uses student growth percentiles, but they include it in the model in a different way, which I think is quite distinct from Illinois. They award points based on the percent of students, when you look at these sub bullets there on the right-hand side, that move from non-proficient or proficient to proficient or higher, or meet their adequate growth percentile target. An adequate growth percentile answers the question, what's the rate of growth required to maintain or reach proficiency in a set amount of years? Usually it's something like 3 years or end of 8th grade, whichever comes first. And again, that's a very growth to standard type question. So if Chris Domaleski scores a 250 and proficiency is 300, then we want to calculate and say, what growth rate does Chris have to get in order to get 300? Let's say I'm in 6th grade now, in 8th grade 2 years from now. The answer to that question is what we call an adequate growth percentile. And the way Michigan includes it in the accountability system is to say, we're going to look at the percent of students that are meeting their adequate growth percentile, which is another way of saying the percent of students who are growing to standard. And I don't think Michigan uses it, but it's also possible to do that at the higher level too. So you can set a growth target to say, here's a student who's proficient. What growth rate is required for that student to be advanced? We can answer that question a similar way, and that can now meet my target. So there's this idea that even though you're at a proficiency level, we want you to keep growing at a rate that shows that you'll be advanced. and I see your hand, Craig, and I promise I'll come to you in just a second. Sometimes the terms catch up, keep up, move up are used to describe this kind of methodology. So catch up means get to proficiency, keep up would mean stay at proficiency, move up would be move to values higher than proficiency. And you can get a growth target for any of those. So Greg, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is very clear. Thanks, Chris. I wondered, and this is maybe an aside that you don't have information on it, but it always piques my curiosity when I see numbers that seem odd, like 29% for student proficiency, 34% for growth, 3%, 14%. I mean, they seem purposefully chosen, not sort of serendipitously. So do you have a sense of, there must have been some weighting considered that produced a desirable overall outcome or something? Do you have any background on how Michigan chose these weights?
I don't, and if somebody else does, I'd welcome that. In fact, I'm grinning because I was actually at a convening last week, an accountability collaborative convening, and the gentleman who oversees Michigan's accountability system presented on it. The gentleman's name is Chris Janzer, a really terrific leader, and he commented on that very point. He said, "I know 34 looks odd. I have no idea how we got there." So yeah, I'm sure somebody does in Michigan, but the gentleman who is responsible for the model didn't immediately know. Yeah. Let me linger a little bit on see if you have any questions about Michigan, because I'm going to move to value tables next. And so again, there are many more states that use SGPs, but I wanted to show these because these are two very distinct methods. One that I'm calling very norm reference, and one that I'm calling very growth to standard centric.
Chris, as we go through each one, one of the deliverables here is to list each option, but also pros and cons of each one. Did you plan on getting into that today, or what are your thoughts on that going forward?
I'm hoping that our conversation after the model review will really elicit that. Because yes, I do hope that we get to that today.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So the next category of growth models I thought we would reflect on together are those that are called value tables. I've also heard them called transition tables or categorical growth. These are all methods that establish growth categories that are presumably based on meaningful performance thresholds, and then you assign points for progression from one category to the next. It's common to establish those categories by working from the intact performance levels on the assessment, and I think that's one of the appealing features to many proponents of this approach, is to say that the performance levels that are meaningful to the state are baked into the growth solution. And because that's fairly coarse, if you just look at progression from level 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, it's very common for a state to subdivide levels, and I'll show you some examples. The other thing, and I think this is the reason why the term value tables emerged, is that it gives policymakers a way to imbue policy values in those growth scores. So for example, a state may wish to award more points from moving from non-proficient to proficient, or moving multiple performance levels. And so you can sort of bake in those values. So, so straight away, there's two benefits to a value table approach, according to those that are proponents of this model. It's relationship to standards, and the fact that any progression is by definition meaningful, and you can build those policy values in. Some people also like value tables because they're one of the more straightforward and simple to understand.
Definitely sounds like a pro.
Mississippi uses value tables. Christy and I have a chance to work with Mississippi a little bit, so we're both pretty familiar with this approach. She may want to add a little bit to this if she's inclined. Here's an overall view of their accountability components for elementary and middle school. So you'll see growth is about 55% of a school's possible score. They have and in here, you might say, well, why are these 95s and 35s? I'm sort of inspired by Greg's question regarding Michigan. I do have an answer for that in this case. If you take English language progress out, then all of these 95s become 100s. And a lot of schools don't have ELP. I think that's probably the case in every state. So if schools don't have in size to have an English learner group, then this is just 100, 100, 100 across the board. If you do have an English learner group, then they created this 35 points. They got to come from somewhere, and that's about 5% of the weight. But you'll see they've got growth for all students and growth for the lowest 25% of students. And that should sound familiar to folks in Louisiana. They have, and they're using a value table in each case. And the next slide will show what that looks like. So in Mississippi, you get points for progressing from one level to another. You get 1 point. Again, imagine this at the student level, and then it's going to be rolled up to the school level. If you progress 2 or more levels to proficiency, you get a little quarter-point bonus. If you progress to or maintain level 5, which is a very rigorous, very distinguished level of performance in Mississippi, then you get a bonus. You get a quarter-point bonus, and you can see, some of these jumps are illustrated here. And the level 1 is associated with the 1 performance level on the test. Level 2 is a performance level. Level 3, level 4, level 5, and they've divided up levels 1, 2, and 3. And you don't need me to read each of the steps there, but you see that the model works by just look at a student. You'll say Chris was 2B in year 1 and 3A in year 2. So that's worth 1 point.
So it says progress to or maintaining at level 5 is 1.25. What about maintaining at level 4?
Don't think that one gets a bonus point, a bonus quarter point. But you can see it's a great question because it illustrates all that's configurable. If that's a policy value for the state, then they can award it. And they can award it. Let's say that's 1.1, 1.5, or something else. And essentially it works because students are either getting a point or not. If we just set aside the quarter point for a moment, essentially works as kind of the percent of students at a school that are meeting growth targets. There's 100 students at a school and 50 of them are meeting the growth target, and they get a 50. If some of those students are getting the bonus points, then that'll be nudged up a little bit.
So one of the things we talked about early on was looking at the student population and the fact that our student population is more heavily weighted to the bottom 2/3. And there was a lot of conversation around, well, the more challenging environments, that's harder work, should be recognized as more value, should get more credit for growth in those areas. That's one of the conversations here. As I look at this, Mississippi, it's like on the bottom end of the scale. If you move 1 step, it's 1 point, 2 steps, it's 2 points. And if you go 4 steps, it's 1.25. Then I go to the top of the scale. If you go 2 steps, it's 1.25 from 3B. So, obviously the concept here, you can put whatever values you want in here and weight it whatever way you want. You have some flexibility to do that. I'm just wondering, based on the distribution of the student population, any thoughts from your group about what particular weights should be applied, given that you have those that data from Louisiana?
See if any of my colleagues want to take a.
Go ahead, Mike.
No, go, Christy.
I was going to say I had opinions on that. And in Mississippi, they value proficiency and advanced performance. And so they value anybody that moves to that level 5, which is advanced performance, or maintaining that level 5, a lot more than they value students lingering in the lowest achievement level of 1A, 1B. And so the reason their values are down at 1 point for moving just half of an achievement level is because that outcome is not as valuable to the student as being proficient is. The outcomes for students are more valuable if they're moving up to proficiency. You see from 1A to 3A, it's moving up to achievement levels, or for maintaining proficiency and moving up. So Mississippi bases their values on what's valuable to the student. And I would be concerned if we are giving more credit for students making smaller improvements at the lower end of the scale, just because it's a perceived more challenging environment to work in. So students that need the most help, but still aren't achieving outcomes that are going to be valuable to them, the school should not be getting additional points for.
But Christy, what about the same size step on either end of the scale? How would you compare the value there?
So the number of steps that
Yeah.
a student improves is the same all the way through. So you get 1 point for going 1A, 1B, 1B, 2A, 2A, 2B. So every time you move one of those steps, you get a point. Where Mississippi values lie are if students move more than the one step. So going from 1A to 3A, or if they're moving from 3B to 5, or staying at 5. So if you're moving multiple steps, they value that progress more. And if you're moving to an advanced level of performance, they value that more. So they're valuing big growth and advanced performance.
But there's no 4A and 4B and 5A and 5B. So the step sizes look to me to be different. So it's hard for me to compare.
Yeah.
Unless I just looked at 2 steps on the bottom is comparable to 1 step on the top.
And the reason why is because the achievement level descriptors are for achievement level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if you see across the bottom, the one orange bar, that's achievement level 1. It comes with its own achievement level descriptor, but they wanted to still award growth credits because it's a criterion based and more challenging to do, to move from the bottom of achievement level 1 to the top of achievement level 1. They did not split out achievement level 4 or achievement level 5. Those are proficient achievement levels. And so maintaining within that achievement level 5 is the growth indicator. Achievement level 4 is already proficient. If they maintain a level 4, they earn a point because they've maintained their proficiency. If they move up to a level 5, they get a bonus because of 1.25 because they've moved to that advanced performance. So that's how they're valuing. So if you're moving up that 4 to 5, you're getting 1.25 points because you're moving to that advanced performance.
Christy,
Go ahead, Thomas.
just one quick question. Could it also have something to do with the CSIM and the size of the categories down at the bottom end? Because I know in Louisiana, our bottom category is huge. So dividing the lowest category in half would be the same size as not dividing the 4th category in terms of scale score.
I don't know for sure if that's true in Mississippi or not. Chris might be able to better address that, but I know their achievement level split at 1 or 2 is basically just in half.
So to use Chris's language, I mean, this is all totally configurable, and it can be based on a state's distribution or a state's policy goals, right? So you could have 3 levels at 1. You could have 1 ABC if you wanted to recognize progress within level 1, and certainly you could have 4A and 4B and 5A and 5B to create an equal number of steps all along the distribution. So then you would apply these 1 points or 1.25s again based on values that a state would have for what it's wanting to recognize. For example, Mississippi, and I think this makes sense, wants to value getting to proficient more than progress within a low level. Again, I think this is all configurable and based on the data that you have, not just about the distribution of students, but also I thought I heard somebody mention the CSEM. Maybe that was Thomas. If category 5 has very few people in it and it's got a large conditional standard error measurement, splitting it up into 2 subcategories doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll go back to Chris's word configurable. But also on the previous slide, Krista, you were saying they value this kind of thing more than the other thing. After that slide we just saw is done, then this sort of value table approach comes into play. And this is where they do give some added credit for moving the lowest performing students, because there's an additional 95 points for growth of the lowest quartile of students. So, but again, that's configurable also in this value table.
Yeah, and it's the same growth metric that's used for the lowest performing students. It's just placing double emphasis on them.
Exactly.
So, Greg, I think that's even more to the point of why you maybe wouldn't want to overvalue growth that is not meaningful to a student in achievement level 1, is because then they would focus only on growth that isn't really meaningful to a student because they're being counted twice in that area. So it's just being careful. Value tables work for the values you set. If you truly value growth within achievement level 1 and provide 1 or 2 points for moving up within achievement level 1, that's the growth you'll get, because schools will say, oh, well, we get 2 points for moving a kid in achievement level 1, and we only get 1 point for moving a kid up to proficient. So we'll just incentivize growth in those lower performing. So that's the one thing to consider is, Chris is showing you examples of well thought out value tables that have made a difference. But value tables can go wrong too, because it is inherently based on values, and whatever you value is generally what you're going to see as outcomes.
Yeah, the only small quibble I'll have was, is characterizing a value table as going wrong, because it really does just instantiate one's values in terms of policy. So, for example, I'm not arguing for this. I'm just saying this is what a policy perspective might be. Is that some educators might say, I deal with the hardest to educate students, the lowest performing students, but the hand I've been dealt is a bunch of students at 1A, right? And it's very difficult to move them. And you could actually study how difficult it is for students to move across levels. If the argument is that it's very difficult to move those lowest performing students from 1A to 1B, then a state could do what perhaps Mississippi has done, and I'm not sure what their motivation was, but they could say, we're going to recognize some of that work that was done, and again, that's a policy more than a technical matter, I think, and we're probably getting into the pros and cons as was suggested earlier.
Yeah, very much so. I appreciate it. To your point, Greg, that's what I'm trying to get my hands around is the value proposition here, right? Is the value to the student and the work that's required to attain that value, and is that work more difficult at the bottom level versus the top level for the same amount of growth? That's what I'm trying to get my hands around.
Can I offer a slightly
existing data? You could look historically, how many students actually do transition across those cuts that were dropped in there. And that's another side question I had for Chris, probably not to answer today, but for future thinking, is how was the cut between 1A and 1B set, right? Level 1, level 2, those are performance levels that were established by the state, but 2A and 2B were sort of post hoc dropped in. There was a cut within level 2, within level 3, and so forth. And it'd be interesting to know how those are established.
I'd like to go back to something that Christy said, and just, she said something about it being a really well-designed value table. And one thing that I just think would be helpful is to ground ourselves in Louisiana's data when we talk about looking at this value table, because I think that it would illustrate an example that Christy might say might not be a good thing to just adopt this as it's written. So level 1 is from 650 to 700. That is the width of level 1. If you divide that in half, you get to 675 and 700, right, as your 2 cut points. The CSIM in that area is like 22. So would you design this with 1 being cut into 1A, 1B? I'm not sure that I would, but I'm curious what the panel would say about that, because that is important information to have. Because are you really measuring accurately if you're saying the cut point is 25 and the error is 22? Curious what the reaction to that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be in a region where it's appropriately sensitive to progress, and that progress is meaningful and easily or distinguishable from error. And there's a tension here. And again, if the purpose here is for us to really acknowledge the pros and cons, there's a tension between the ability of the model to distinguish degrees of progress and not be too coarse, so that meaningful movement isn't recognized, or too difficult to disentangle from error. So I'll give you sort of a.
Thomas, the same problem or the same issue happens at the upper level too, right? At level 5, there could be a large CSEM, and you could be making, if you made it 5A and 5B, which is why some states, Chris, check me if I'm not thinking about this right, but I believe some states give that same, like, let's say 1 point to maintaining level 5, or even going from 5 to 4, because there's a large amount of measurement in precision there. So if you just stay within those top 2 levels, you're still awarded a point in the system.
Yeah, and in our system, level 5's cut does move. So at various points it can be lower because of the very thing that you're describing.
Yeah.
Mike, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to share 2 thoughts. One, we just started to happen, that I think it's useful to understand what Mississippi has done here, but I think it's going to be more important, if you want to consider this, to think about what it is that Louisiana wants to prioritize, what they want to motivate, and at the same time, I mean, one of the things I think is valuable about the value table is that you can embed values into it, right? Whereas the other methods, you kind of can, but not really. It's much more difficult. And what you're really doing here is incentivizing schools and teachers to focus on specific subset of students where they're going to get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of the points they're going to get in the system. But that also means that you're disincentivizing areas where there's not as much of a bang for a buck. So I think you really need to be thoughtful about how you assign these points, so that you're both balancing what you're incentivizing and minimizing what you're disincentivizing. Because again, if you put very little value on any kind of growth down at the very, very low levels, effectively you're telling schools it's not important to be helping those kids at those low levels. You're better off putting your effort into the kids who are in the 3, 4s, and 5s. And I don't think that's probably the message that anybody wants to be sending.
Well, I would just generalize your comment, Mike, which I think is an outstanding one, is that every one of these approaches sort of instantiates a value proposition, right?
Yeah.
If the previous approach, if you include a large percentage of weight for helping English language learners, right? The school would focus on that, or attendance, or chronic absenteeism. I mean, there's every single one of these has that as a pro/con, that it does instantiate those values.
Yeah, I was speaking specifically to the thinking about the different growth methods. But you're right, Greg, exactly. I mean, that's what you're doing in your accountability system, right? When you say what's in there and how much you're going to weight it.
Is there any evidence to suggest that states with student populations more heavily weighted towards the lower end, that providing more incentive for marginal growth on that end relative to the same marginal growth on the other end, if you're putting more weight where your student population is larger, is there any evidence to suggest there's any better performance results when those systems are put in place?
Yeah, I don't know the answer, and one of the reasons is because it's so hard to make causal attributions related to accountability specifications. There's a field of debate in our field about how much accountability specifications
But should that be part of our consideration, is incentive providing incentive as well as assessing academic growth? So that's a question. I don't know the answer.
Well, I would frame it like this. I would say, if we can't construct a very persuasive theory of action or logic model about how the model is specified and how the supports that accompany it are linked to it to promote better outcomes for students, then we've lost our way. So I agree with that. But yeah, I was trying to respond very specifically to whether I've seen any data that tries to make a claim about a model specification, particular student outcome.
Any comments from any of your panel on that?
Christine, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in to say that I think part of the challenge that we're running into in that we're identifying in the conversation is kind of the rub between wanting to ensure really well-rounded, high-quality learning opportunities for students who have reached proficiency and wanting to make sure that we're continuing to challenge them and provide the best opportunities possible. But the very spirit of the federal law that kind of sets and charts the requirements for accountability is focused on identifying opportunity gaps and specifically on mandating that we're identifying places where there is the greatest distance between either subgroups of students or whole school populations of students where they are so far behind that they need additional support through funding and other means articulated in states' plans. So it's hard to identify whether it would help motivate or support improvement on the 3s, 4s, and 5s area, because the required focus has always been kind of stretching and elongating and looking at what kind of progress and opportunity is being made for the students who are struggling the most or have the least access to opportunities. So there's kind of a conflicting underlying policy purpose that led to the accountability system requirements.
Thank you. Mr. Castillo?
So if I can back up a little bit, the reason why I think we're all going through this exercise is that, particularly for those of us who've been on the board for the last 4 years, is that we came in with sort of the charge of how do we improve student outcomes across the state? How do we ensure that our children are learning as much as possible and achieving? And then we add to that, going back to Mr. Morris's point, that we have an extraordinarily high number of students who are or disadvantaged, a really, really high number in that state. And those students are the students that tend to perform the worst, as I understand it. If our goal as a state is to no longer be in the upper 40s in the rankings, sort of at the bottom, but to move our achievement something greater in the 30s or even higher in terms of student outcomes, it seems that the focus would be, and that there perhaps may even be low-hanging fruit that the students who are having the most challenges, that to me, it would seem would be where we'd want to place the greatest amount of resources and incentivize the education system and systems around the state to do that. Local school boards, schools, teachers. And in my simplistic way of thinking, that if we were to do that and make considerable strides, that as a state, we would see overall greater progress. So at the end of the day, I guess I'm trying to get the answer, and I'm not sure if this is the right group, and you may be tossing the question back to us. The most simple question is, how do we create an accountability system that allows us to accomplish that sort of achievement? And that may be incentivizing, as we said, more at the lower end, more at the higher end. Now, at the end of the day, we certainly want to not lose anything. We want those high-performing students to continue to perform well. But if our goal is to not continue to be at the bottom of the country in terms of academic performance, but to start to move up, how do we accomplish that? So in a measurable way, that if we changed our accountability system, that next year and the following year and the year after that, we should see some expected outcome. Mr. Morris asked the question, do we know of any other states that have done something like that, such that their student population is similar to ours, where we can look to and say that they've done these things and they've gotten these outcomes? So one, I'd probably want to go back to that question. And if we don't know that answer today, is that something we could research and find out? And then two, the more basic question is, looking at other states with a similar student profile to ours, academically, socioeconomically, what is the best approach to use? And if we assume that that's kind of our value system, what it is that we're hoping to accomplish, I guess what we're looking to learn from experts such as yourself and other experts that are out there that may be listening, what's the right answer? Or can you point us in the right direction?
So those are all great points. And I think Chris has kind of pointed us in a direction with the Mississippi example. So very demographically similar, economically similar, was 50th in the nation a mere 10 years ago on their rankings, and now are above the national average in all 4 subjects. And if you break it out by student group, they're in the top 10 for Black and free and reduced price lunch students in the rankings when you compare it to their peers across the nation. So there's a couple of points that are, I think, maybe getting entangled in here. Greg brought up the fact that we have the lowest 25% component in Mississippi. From the previous slide, that basically is saying any student that's the lowest performing based on last year's test results is double counted in growth. So this forces schools to pay attention to the lowest performing students in their school. So the calculation is based on, what did the students score last year? And is it that one of the lowest 25% of scores in my school this year? And if so, those kids are double counted for growth. So there is that extra emphasis and focus on those traditionally lowest performing students in each individual school. The next piece of that is the growth conversation that we're having. Mississippi has a pretty rigorous growth conversation. Tom has pointed this out when he asked the question about CSEMs and why split level 1, level 2, level 3. Mississippi would value moving from level 1 to level 2, level 2 to level 3, level 3 to level 4. But because that is such a challenging and demanding expectation, they went back and said, is progress from 1A to 1B still progress? And will that student eventually get to proficiency? Because Mississippi values making sure that we are moving kids to some outcome that is meaningful to them in the future. So Mississippi split their achievement levels in level 1 and level 2. Students and schools are still getting full credit for a student that moves an achievement level, whether it's a step up within the 1A, 1B, or moving across achievement levels. So the incentive here is, one, we're double counting the lowest performing students. Two, we're giving full credit to any student that moves from the low level to the high level. The challenge that they had was some higher performing schools as well said, well, we can't let them not focus on higher performing kids too, which is how they ended up giving a 1/4 of a point bonus point at level 4 and level 5, which is a pretty nominal amount of points in the grand scheme of things. So there's a couple layers here how Mississippi has incorporated not just the calculation, but an additional indicator for growth. And they have seen remarkable progress moving students forward and moving their lowest performing students up. So their value is making sure students have a meaningful outcome when they leave school, but they are crediting and awarding those movements within those non-proficient levels. And then kind of the final aspect of this is, if the intent is truly to award schools the support and resources they need for their lowest performing students, we should not be over awarding points to schools for outcomes that aren't meaningful to those lowest performing students. So if we are trying to over award points at level 1 and level 2, the focus is only going to be moving half an achievement level, half of an achievement level. And then those schools are not going to be identified because they're earning so many points for that nominal movement that they no longer will be the lowest performing students in the state. And so they're not going to qualify for those supports and resources. So we want to make sure that if we are identifying schools, that we're not awarding points at the lowest level for those most in need students by saying, well, it's a hard atmosphere to work in, it's a tough environment, these kids come to school and they might not be prepared, or they've been traditionally underserved, so we're just going to automatically award points because it's harder, because then that's kicking them out of the lowest performing schools to get those extra supports and resources. So think about how we want to send those messages and send those values. We don't want to overemphasize nominal pieces of progress, because then they no longer will be eligible for those supports and resources that they need.
That was a great response, and I have a knowledge gap, and that is I don't know when I look at this how it compares to what we're currently doing in Louisiana. So if we overlaid our current system in which we award points, can someone walk me through, and I don't know if you can or not, sitting here, if we were, again, sort of side by side, how do we compare in our accountability system to what Mississippi is doing?
I think the easiest thing to do would be for Chris to go back to slide 6.
Okay.
Because what we're doing, you can't really overlay it because there's like not a Venn diagram there. It's just completely different. Maybe not slide 6, the one that says common approaches to growth. That one. So we have 2 steps in ours. So you can get points one of 2 ways. The first step is gain score. Are you making enough movement to eventually get to mastery in the future based off the number of years you have left? So if you have 3 years left and you have 15 points to go, you have to go 5 points a year to get to mastery within the amount of time you have left in school. So you can get points that way. If you don't do that, then we go to the regression or value added, which is the last item in the table, which is the VAM model. So we do not do the Florida model or Mississippi model in any way. They're just different.
So we peppered you folks when we're going through this accountability discussion with, can someone provide us a simulation? So we assumed that we applied the Mississippi model or the Michigan model or the Florida model. What would then be our outcomes based on past data that exists.
And I think that we talk about apply the model.
Yep.
But the model has to be informed by the things we know about our state and the values that we want in our state. So, for example, when we talked about the Mississippi model, if the bottom achievement level is only 50 points wide, you divide it in half, that's 25 points per section, and the error down there is 22. You're like the width of the section you're talking about is the amount of error in the thing. So you would literally, if you just took the Mississippi model and dropped it in Louisiana, you would be awarding points down at the bottom for statistically completely insignificant, like worse than flipping a coin odds. So right, you have to, we could just pick up and drop the Mississippi model and do an analysis of it, but that's ultimately not what I would think the board would adopt, because we need to look at a lot of data, set values, and then apply those to the value table to get a good value table approach. I don't know if that made
So
any
let me
sense.
ask a follow-up question then. So help me understand, if you can, what is the benefit of then looking at this Mississippi model if we really don't know if the Mississippi model would work in our case?
Somebody want to answer that besides me?
Yeah, can I just say, I just want to respond in two ways here. One is, I think it's important not to be looking at the details of Mississippi for the purpose of your program. Chris can speak for himself, but I read what we're looking at here are examples of ways that you could approach this. There are different approaches, and this is one example of one of those approaches. Second thing, I think we might be getting a little confused, because particularly as Greg was saying earlier, there's values being applied in two different ways. In the value table specifically, you're applying values as you're determining, like in that first step where you're saying, as a kid goes from 1 to 2, I'm going to award X number of points. As they go from 1 to 3, I'm going to award Y number of points. Right? That's one set of values and points that are being assigned. There's a potential then to have another set, like in the slide that was before that step thing, where you're assigning different points or percents based on different cells, which are representing different demographic groups or subgroups of students. And then there's a third in the accountability system itself, where you're saying what is going to count in accountability and how much are each thing's accounting. So I would encourage us, as we're having this conversation, to be clear about what part of the system are we actually talking about, and keep our thinking as much focused on that part as possible, because they are all interrelated, but we can also talk about them, I think, separately.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate that comment, Mike, and I just want to amplify it. And you accurately characterized what I hope that we can accomplish. Is I feel very strongly that and I'm not suggesting that anybody else is suggesting this, but I feel very strongly that the approach is to say, well, let's shop around at other states' models and adopt one that we think is sort of an example of best practice. I think the point is, let's understand the pros and cons. Let's understand Louisiana's values. And by the way, this conversation has been great in helping elevate what some of those values and policy priorities are. And then let's be aware of the technical tools and levers that we have to do that. Nobody is going to speak more enthusiastically about the great team in Mississippi and the work they've done than I am. But at the same time, I'll also say that I don't think that adopting their growth model is the way to move Louisiana forward. Mississippi will tell you that they had that accountability is a tool situated in a larger wraparound support initiative, and I think that's the way to think about it. And also, the unit of analysis I think is really important here. That is there it is a true statement that you can take a VAM estimate based on Louisiana's model, based on North Carolina's model, based on Illinois' model, and you can use it in so many different ways as to elevate these priorities that we're talking about. So I just want to encourage us to, I think Mike said it really well, but I do appreciate this conversation is elevating those priorities in ways that are going to help us to provide some good feedback.
There's some,
I mean, Just as
another
a simple
follow-up.
analogy, I mean, think about these growth measures as models of cars, right? And you know, we end up picking a model of car, but then we go in and we put specific specifications into the car. So I think right now the conversation is around what model do we want to gravitate towards, and then what features do we want in that model?
So, and again, please forgive me. You folks know so much more about this than I do. In Mississippi, for example, with their accountability system, Chris just spoke earlier about that the information that they gain from this data with regard to accountability is only one piece that they use to help them advance their education system. So question number one, something I probably should know. How is it that that particular state, Mississippi, uses SPS scores? They have letter grades, they have performance scores, I presume, the same way that we have here in Louisiana, correct? Is that right? So can someone tell me a little bit more about how they use their scores to inform other activities that they might use to support students? And I apologize that this might be taking us a little bit off script, but these are things I just want to make sure I understand.
I can speak a little bit to that. So the accountability system was their kind of first major education reform that they had in Mississippi. From that, they looked at reading scores and results from reading and implemented their big science of reading push. Looked at hiring reading coaches, professional development, and training. So they've really pushed there. They've looked and reevaluated graduation requirements and how to advance college and career pathways based on some of the results they're seeing in their accountability system, and what things that they need to do in order to give kids more options and opportunities post high school, and what that will look like. They are now pursuing a math initiative to help improve math scores and move forward on that. So they look at and use these pieces of data, not just exclusively the indicators here, but general data from the accountability system and how these indicators interact in order to make some high-level policy decisions. But primarily, the purpose of the accountability system is to guide state-level policy and resource decisions. So if you see schools really struggling with reading, as Mississippi did, their big focus was making sure that they had a comprehensive reading program based on the science of reading, and allocated resources and made sure that those schools that were the lowest performing in those areas were getting more targeted help and support, but advancing that statewide as well. Meant that they looked at and adopted some new reading curriculum and how to encourage districts to adopt science of reading materials. So this is just one way to help policymakers like the board or even the legislature set their priorities for upcoming years, and where to allocate or budget more dollars, and how to really target and focus in what the needs are of the state.
So my last question, Mr. Chairman. So in other states, so there are a number of charter school networks who operate in different states. Michigan's one, Florida, Texas. And what I hear from many of them is that when they come to Louisiana, that they are applying the same model, academic model, but they struggle so much more in this state. And one of the reasons they say large networks that are national networks is that the accountability system here is much more stringent, rigorous, difficult compared to some of the other states that they operate in, Michigan, Florida, Texas. Any opinions about whether that, Chrissy, you're the only one on my screen for whatever reason here on the Zoom, and you're smiling as to suggest that you do have an opinion about that.
So as the former accountability director in Florida, I heard the exact same thing from the major network providers 15 years ago in Florida, that the system was too hard, it's too rigorous, it's too high of expectations. It's not fair to our schools when we're just starting out. It's not fair to us as we're building and adding grade by grade in our charters. And so I don't think it's exclusive or unique to Louisiana. I think that no matter where they go, when they're setting up and there's new expectations, it's challenging. It's hard to start schools. So I don't think it's unique to Louisiana, and I don't think the expectations in the Louisiana system are more rigorous. In fact, I would say in a lot of cases, they're not as rigorous as some other states that we are working in, including Mississippi and Florida.
Interesting. Thank you.
Let me see if I can nudge us along. This has been good conversation, and Mr. Castillo, you may have seen I briefly displayed, we had some content in our October meeting where we walked through the Louisiana model. And so I just wanted, in case you or anybody else wanted sort of a primer on the Louisiana growth approach, we have those from the October materials. But I do appreciate the good conversation. Let me just quickly, because we're due a break here in just a moment, and I really want to get to this rich conversation. I'll get more of this rich conversation. It's already surfacing. I'm going to be super brisk and going through, I think, just two more models. And again, as Mike helped clarify, just to help us pressure test strengths and weaknesses. Alaska also uses a value table. Theirs is much more coarse. As you can see, there it's an up down, it's a point or no point for the conditions that are shown on this table here. Growth accounts for 40% of the scores. And you can see that, so we've got the previous year performance. This it's like far below proficient. Below proficient, proficient, advanced, and then they divide those categories into low and high, and they've got those same categories in the current year. And they're simply saying the student goes from far below low to far below high, they get a point. It's similar to Mississippi, because they don't have the quarter points. They reward a lot more staying in levels than Mississippi does. And it really does help us illustrate one of the limitations of value tables. And I spoke to many of the strengths, so I'm not trying to put my thumb on the scale here. But one of the limitations is that value tables are much more correlated with status than are value-added models or student growth percentile. So if I were to say, produce a correlation between the Alaska growth measure and prior year proficiency rates, that correlation is going to be a lot higher than, say, a median student growth percentile or a value-added score in prior proficiency rates. And the reason that matters is people will say, we want growth to pick up on something that's very distinct. And if I just keep putting things that relate highly to proficiency in there, why do I need a bunch of things telling me the same thing? Now, I've characterized that to an extreme, but I just wanted to make a point here about the trade-offs involved in these models.
Chris, is it, I mean, I don't know if it's accurate to say it the way I'm about to say it, but the matter of trade-offs is partially present. I mean, there's two separable issues. One is how you measure growth, and two, how you reward it.
Yep.
So I think we should keep those somewhat separable, because student growth percentiles is one way of measuring growth. Value added is one way of measuring growth. Category change is another way of measuring growth. But that's completely agnostic as to how one rewards that then.
maybe even, and maybe it's baked into your how it's rewarded, that there's at least two components to that. What's your definition of good enough growth? And then what's the growth influence on the overall student score? And yeah, I couldn't agree more strongly. Those decisions matter a lot. Yeah.
Just if I could, just to make that,
Yes, sir.
put a pin in that. In the previous slide, you could take those check marks out of the box from example P low to P low. You could choose not to reward that.
Yes.
Okay.
The other thing that you could do is you could replace those check marks with points. And some
Yes.
you could say far below low to far below high is worth 100 points. But below, or excuse me, proficient low to proficient high is worth 75 points. And that's another way of saying we're going to give you a lot more influence towards a favorable rating by moving those students who are below proficient closer to proficient.
Right. And I'm just arguing that we probably need to keep these issues somewhat separately, because there's a highly technical side of it, which is how you measure growth. And then there's the much more policy aspect of it, which is what you choose to reward.
I think it gets back to my original comments about differentiating between assessment and incentive. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I'll just introduce the panel and participants to one other model. Again, it's more for the sake of completeness here. So we mentioned some states are doing gain scores. I actually have some opinions about gain scores. Again, I don't want to like overly, I don't want to stuff the ballot box here, but gain scores require a vertical scale. We're talking about, another way I could call this is just simple subtraction methods. If you got a value table, excuse me, a vertical scale, you can take a score from the current year, subtract the prior year score. The difference is a gain score difference. And Delaware kind of uses a gain score. I actually had a hard time finding any state that uses a pure gain score. Some of my colleagues may know of a good example, but they look at gain score as the numerator, and they look at it as a proportion of a target that they get normatively. And so they'll say, maybe the target was to grow by 50 points. This student grew by 40 points. So they made 80% of their target. And so we're going to give them an 80 out of 100. And you can get a little bit of bonus points, which is why max score is 110. So they've got a hybrid going on here. They use gain scores, but they also have a normatively based growth target. It's at the 60th percentile of expected growth. And they use those together to create their growth metrics. So it's a hybrid approach, but since it did have elements of gain score, I wanted to at least show the panel an example of that.
Chris, just real quick, how are their targets determined? What's the basis for their target?
According to the documentation I saw, it's based on the 60th percentile of expected growth for 8 performance bands. So they take, say, the distribution of performance, they divide it up into 8 categories from lowest to highest, and then they say for that lowest category, what's the, think of a very coarse student growth percentile. What's the distribution of growth for that first of 8 categories? Now I'm going to find the 60th percentile. That's the growth target. Presumably the 60th percentile was thought to be some good enough growth standard. It was thought to be a rate of growth that moves students at a rate that's acceptable. But that's how their documentation says they come up with that.
Thank you.
So I think we covered some of this along the way. I want to pause here because we're a little overdue for a break, but is there anybody on the panel or otherwise that wants to just offer a reflection about the strengths and limitations of the models? Anything I didn't talk about by way of these illustrations that you think would be helpful for the panel to hear? Or something, and I did take some notes along the way, but anything that would be helpful to explore. Let me just see if there's any final comments here before we move. And just to forecast what we're going to do after the break is really lean into conversations about what we prioritize and why, much less me presenting and panel talking. Well, maybe the enticement of a break was enough to have a pause here. So we can come back to this on the other side of the break if you like, but I've got 2:35 Central Time. Shall we come back at 2:50 Central Time and resume? So a 15-minute break, is that okay?
Okay, we can do that and then pick up at this point.
Yes, sir.
All right. All right.
We'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we're back. I don't think we're gonna go through any formal process here. Chris, if you would just pick us up where we left off, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, I, as promised, will do less by way of presentation in this section of the meeting. If you'll permit colleagues 5 to 10 minutes, let me cover some broad ground. And I really wanted to open up the conversation, but I think we've already made some headway on, but hopefully we can lean into more explicitly. So obviously what we want to do as a group is to provide some principled feedback to the board about the growth approaches that are most promising.
Hey, Chris, excuse me just a second. I'm reminded that we do have a formal process, and we do, and since we're moving on to item 3.2, that we are going to need a motion to do that. So excuse the interruption here. I got a motion from Dr. Davis and a second from Mr. Castile. And so now that we have that motion on the floor, if you would pick us up, I'd appreciate it. And again, apologize for the interruption.
Did we vote on the last motion? We got her on the floor.
Yes, I believe we had unanimous support for the last motion. Without objection. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. You got the ball now, Chief.
Yes, sir. We want to lean into some discussion of the values or the priorities, what we value and why. And I thought it might be helpful, colleagues, to group this into 3 categories. The first is definitely the most dense, and I think we'll spend most of our time talking about policy considerations. I do think there are some practical considerations we ought to acknowledge and see if the panel has some feedback or some guidance on. I think probably less time, this may seem a little counterintuitive to you to think about technical considerations, only because they're not that contentious. When you ask people, do you want a valid, reliable, appropriately precise growth model? I think most people will come to yes pretty quick. Although I do want to put out some criteria before the panel and get your feedback on it. So that's the roadmap of how I propose to proceed here. And if it's agreeable with the panel, I'll quickly go through the 3 slides together, so I'm going to brain around it in total, and then I'll come back to this slide, which, by the way, has the most on it. It's probably a 101 for how not to put together a PowerPoint slide because I've got too much text on it. But there are a number of policy considerations, many of which we've already acknowledged, and I won't read this to you, but you'll recognize some of these important prompts that I recommend that we speak to. What are the most important growth questions to answer? What's good enough growth? What growth information at the student level is going to inform and incentivize improvement? Again, I think that's a policy or a judgment question. We talked about some different frames for that in our previous conversation. How should growth be used in accountability? I've made the claim a number of times already in this meeting that those kinds of decisions, I think, matter as much as the model itself. I think we should talk about whether background factors are included, why or why not. If there are certain outcomes that are particularly important to detect. Again, we gave examples of that already in our conversation, such as progress for students below proficient. And I think any thoughtful conversation about accountability in general or growth, we ought to ask ourselves, are there unintended negative consequences we need to be on the lookout for? The answer is certainly yes. But naming those, I think, will help us provide good feedback to the board.
Chris, before you go any further, a couple questions here for me. When we talk about is the student's growth similar to his or her academic peers? And then we talk about students' growth relative to a standard. And then is the student's growth good enough? That's where I think we need to think about our fundamental expectations here. Should we have the same expectations for all students? I mean, should all students ultimately get to a certain point, and it's just a matter of how quickly their growth is to get there, or how much growth is required to get there in a certain amount of time?
Why don't we just
so that we have the same expectations for outcomes? Should we have the same expectations for outcomes for every student? And to me, if we do, okay, but if we don't, then how does that affect the goals that we have for different students?
Since that's provoking some thoughts or feedback, why don't why don't we just stay with this slide for a little while? Why don't we lean into some of these questions? And let me open the floor to the board, the panel, to offer reflections.
So I'll offer a really sort of off the wall reflection here about these first two questions. They're labeled as norm referenced and growth to standard. It seems to me that one way that you could have labeled these is sort of more system focused versus student focused. Is a student's growth similar to his or her academic peers is a way of really rewarding sort of systems interventions and getting kids higher growth than their peers. And I'm calling that system focused. The second one, growth to standard, is really more student focused, which is this student getting to a place where we want them to get, accomplishing the kinds of mastery of standards that we've deemed to be necessary as a state. So I think there's also, growth and norms sort of are other ways of saying where are you wanting to put the emphasis on sort of rewarding a system for moving a student along a continuum, or emphasizing the student and his or her mastery of content.
Greg, can I ask you, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your distinction here. And I'll give an example. So under what Chris has labeled as the norm referenced,
Mm-hmm.
it's possible that you have students that are showing greater growth than average, but no one in the system is really making meaningful progress. And so it's an extreme example, but I'm just trying to understand. And so in that case, the system isn't really being effective, but some schools might be given a lot of credit for moving kids more than average, even though it's not really all that useful.
Yeah, well, the other way I might have said it is, some students are moving ahead more than their peer group. So maybe some classrooms or school buildings or whatever districts are normatively speaking doing a better job than others, and yet no student conceivably is
right
performing proficiently, right. In the other case, the one that says growth to standard, it's more of a focus on our districts, schools, teachers getting students to those levels we've said they need to get to. And I think also that under other here, I wouldn't leave out the possibility of both of these being incorporated into a model, sort of a growth toward a standard as well as rewarding or recognizing growth to a standard.
Right.
That's what we do in Louisiana right now, right?
I think so.
This
well,
step two approach.
Is Louisiana, the first part is whether they get to proficiency, correct? And if kids are below proficiency, then it's looking at their growth. Is that correct? I always forget.
I'm gonna pull up the slide that has the step one and step two. Sometimes it's helpful to have it in front of us while we.
Yeah.
But
Louisiana's does two things. The first step acknowledges students' progress toward, over some period of time, getting to proficiency. Mm-hmm. If the school does not accomplish that for the student, then they get a chance to do it through a value-added model. So step one, are they moving on track to mastery? So if they have,
so it's on track to mastery. Okay.
Yeah. And so that's step one. If they don't get the points there, then they get a second chance to get full credit, which is if they're in the 80th to 99th percentile, they get 150 points, all the way down to the 20th to 39th, where they get 25 points.
But it's relative to their peers.
It's relative to their peers.
So it's an either or, not a both.
That's correct.
If you don't get one, then you look at two, but if you get one, you don't go to two. So, and again, what's the rationale for this? What for the, particularly for step two?
I was not here when it was adopted. I would guess that step one was designed to signal a set of behaviors that the goal is for every student to have a target
Right.
and to achieve that. And then the second step was to recognize schools that are exceeding what is happening for that particular student in the student group. Would be my guess as to the answers of the architects that did it. That is not me.
I don't know the architect's intent either, but I'll tell you, step two in most instances where I see it is to reward what educators often say they want rewarded is hard work with difficult populations. So if you have a very low performing population and yet you cause those students to grow much more substantially than their similarly situated low performing peers, that teacher, even though the students aren't at proficient or advanced, that teacher has done a pretty remarkable job. And so they're saying that step two is intended to reward that.
I mean, in that example, isn't that effectively saying we don't think that subgroup of kids can be on track, and therefore we're going to look at a different indicator?
I don't think it's saying that. I think it's trying to incorporate the two things that were on the previous slide, the growth to standard and the norm referenced approach into one system.
I don't know, Mike, I kind of agree with you. You know, we should expect all kids to be on track. We're not saying we expect them to get to proficiency that year or the next year, and sometimes maybe not even the year after, but we do expect them. And it might be more challenging for some students than the other students to get them on track, but we should expect all students to be on track. And it is definitely easier and doesn't always ensure on the normative perspective that students are even going in the right direction. So I think that's a challenge and a value to look at and think about too. And again, it's not both, as you had suggested before, you know, both valuing both mastery and better than their peers. It's looking at, if you can't be on track to mastery, are you at least doing better than your peers, whatever your peers may be doing?
For this, pardon me, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we had a question from the dais too. Dr. Davis.
It wasn't necessarily a question, but just a comment around your question about expectations. And I think that it's really important to point this out. So I think the answer to the question, should we have the same expectations for all students? The answer to that question is yes, but that has to come with recognition of the fact that that creates an unfair advantage for school districts that are serving the kids that are the easiest to educate. And with that recognition comes acknowledging the political reality that in our state, we are unwilling to do what is necessary to even the playing field, period. Right? Like I look at what Mississippi did, and they have a reading coach that is employed by the Department of Education in every one of their elementary schools to make sure that that program is being implemented with fidelity. We couldn't even do that, right? Like we see what's going on and we see that it works, and we can't do that. We can't, you know, raise a minimum wage so that two parents that are working 40 hours a week can live above the poverty line. Like, and these are all factors that are kind of beyond our control as the Department of Education, right? Some of them are, but we can't even do the things that we could do educationally because we're unwilling to invest the resources in doing that. And so the answer is yes, but it also comes with acknowledging the barriers that a lot of our kids have in front of them, and we're not willing to commit to lifting those barriers so that they can achieve their full potential.
So whenever we recognize those gaps, we have to make sure we have the supports in place to take advantage of what we've assessed right? We've assessed the gaps. Now we have to make sure that, since we've accurately assessed them, we have to address them and put the support systems in place.
Right. And it's thinking about what is Mississippi doing with its wraparound services that were mentioned by Christy that we are not doing. Right. And so we can't expect to implement a small part of what Mississippi did and to see the same results, right? Because we did not implement the theory behind the science of reading and what they did with Fidelity.
Right. Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not intimately familiar with your accountability program, but isn't part of the accountability program intended to identify schools that are going to get additional funding and potentially supports? I'm not suggesting it's adequate for the challenges that they are facing, but isn't that part of the point of this?
They do get interventions from the department. And so that comes with extra resources. But I would probably say that it's not enough to confront the needs that their students face.
Yeah, I fully acknowledge that. But so I asked that question only because I think then you want to make sure when you're designing this that you're not doing something that is effectively, for lack of a better word, denying support and funding to a school that actually needs it. Right. So we could come up with a system that says, okay, yeah, if your kids are not meeting these targets, we're going to go to the second tier, just like you do. And, there may be some schools that are servicing students who have many needs, and maybe the school itself may be underfunded, but they're doing a pretty good job. And so therefore they're not qualifying for the additional funds that are really actually needed by those sites.
And I agree with that. And I think that would require, if we were to, change the way we're doing growth, and that we would need to make sure when we were identifying the schools that need to be targeted for extra resources, that we're making sure that we're focusing on the right part of the accountability system. Like, so maybe not looking at their overall score, but looking at, proficiency overall, or where they're struggling and not meeting growth targets. And so that kind of more nuanced look.
Where
so
are the
rather
gaps?
Right. So rather than just looking at an overall letter grade of an F or a D, that we're looking inside their score to try to allocate scarce resources most efficiently and to the schools that really need them.
Mr. Lambert?
Yeah, I appreciate that. All of that. I recently participated in a discussion where we were doing root cause analysis. And when they basically told us that when you reach the point where you're talking about poverty as the issue, you probably need to take a clip back, because you're not going to be able to solve that issue. So I want to make sure that we are like hyper focused on like what are we trying to measure in the accountability system, because it's like, I hear all of the additional resources and tools that we need, but we need to stay focused on what does the growth measure need to do. The idea that, yes, we should do this if these things are true.
Right. And I think
what if not?
Right. And I think to that point, like when I'm thinking about this, I want to think about, because we were asked kind of what do we value? When it comes to the growth piece, what I would like to see growth do is value growth to proficiency and value growth in students who face the greatest barriers to achievement. And so maybe that means focusing somehow like on what Mississippi did with their 25% of the lowest performing kids and growth counting double, right, around there, something along those lines. So I think I've been hanging out with Thomas too much. And so like, I know that growth to proficiency matters, right? But I also do want recognition for the schools that are working with the kids that have the biggest barriers, because then I think if we don't address that, it's going to be impossible for us to get teachers to teach in those schools when they're constantly being told that their work does not, that they're not working hard enough, that they're a failure. And so I think that matters. So,
and maybe to say it a slightly different way, and that is we're not trying to solve the problem of poverty necessarily as the Department of Education or as Bessie, but what we're trying to do is help students overcome the obstacle of poverty. So if a kid is in poverty, we believe that that kid can learn, that is a barrier for success, but what can we do as a system to help that kid overcome those circumstances? So additional supports, better teachers, more resources. What do we need to do? Because we're not going to solve the problem of poverty. Now, I will say, if we improve the quality of education in our state, that will also help solve the problem of poverty at some point in the future. But what we can control now is wherever we find a child, whether low income, middle income, high income, do we have a plan of action that will help support that child wherever he or she is to be successful? And so when we talk about these differentiated models and providing more resources and therefore incentivizing schools and teachers to want to work in these areas and families, because, and I want to say something that everybody knows, and that is, if you're labeled an F school or an F district, families are not going to move there. Teachers are not going to move there. I'm not saying throw away the accountability system in any way, but we've got to take into account that sometimes we fall into the self-fulfilling prophecy of how when we create a system that sort of perpetuates failure in a way, and that a failed system or a failed school. So in terms of creating a value system that allows us to outperform, if you're competitive, and not, tonight we've got high school football games and tomorrow big football weekend. But if we want to outperform other states, then we say, well, where are we most likely to be successful? And that is figuring out a way to move the students, the large number of students that we have that need the greatest amount of support, that will then earn us points. So this were a video game, would be saying, how do we get the most amount of points from this? And we would look to try to solve for that problem. But at the end of the day, if we're trying to help those students who need the most help, and we have a large number of them, but know that if we help them, we then help ourselves as a state. How do we structure a system to do that? And I know there's a lot of debate about how to do it, but I like the where we're going with it, because it's something that Christy, you said earlier that, well, I just really want to dig into that a whole lot more, and that is, what is it that we do that really causes a school or a school system to keep pushing? Is it incremental growth, or is it large chunks of growth that will keep sort of the foot on the gas so that everyone keeps pushing enough? So I appreciate the rich conversation about how do we get there and helping us do that. And hopefully through this whole process, we'll figure that out. We're talking policy considerations, so I'm throwing all these things out because I think that's, at the end of the day, the problem that we, as the State Board of Education and the department, those are problems that we're trying to solve.
I appreciate that. And I would love to ask the board a question, and certainly think the panelists have a reflection on it. I'd be glad to hear that as well. I'd love to take this conversation we're having now about it's important to detect the things that matter and provide supports. How does the inclusion of background factors in Louisiana's growth model, how does that support or inhibit the board's policy priorities? Does the board have any reflections on that?
And can I add to your question, Chris? And that is, in terms of background, in measuring growth, it's extremely difficult, I think, to measure growth with a transient population of students. Students who move from school to school multiple times in a year because families move. And so we're holding sometimes schools and teachers accountable. And it's so difficult because we talk about growth, but who gets the credit? the third teacher that had the student or the third school that had the student that year. And I don't know how we factor that in, because they're just different sets of issues to take into consideration. So
Chris, do you guys, excuse me, Mr. Castillo, do you guys have any experience in that particular space? That's the first time I've had that concept brought into the conversation. But for the transient student population and how you track the progress of those students, is there any experience on your panel with that?
Christy, go ahead. It looks like you've got I see you nodding. Do you want to offer a reflection?
Yeah, and Thomas will probably provide the same answer, is students that aren't in the same school for the full academic year aren't included in any of the calculations for any of the schools. So they're not attributed anywhere in that current school year. The ability for the state to measure and keep track of the students' performance year after year is pretty easy. I mean, and I'm sure Thomas does as well, can go back and look at, no matter what the school the student was in, can find out if the student was assessed, and what the student score report says that will still go home to the parent and still go home to the teacher will reflect the longitudinal history of the student's assessment scores. Unfortunately, no school is held accountable for the student if they're not there for the full academic year. So that attribution question of who gets the credit for the growth is kind of a moot point if the student's not in the same school for the full year.
Well, thank you
And-
for that. Mr. Lambert, can you speak specifically to Louisiana on that one?
Sure. So to start, I would echo everything that Christy said. I'd also say that in our value added model, when a student is transient between years multiple times, the value added model takes that into consideration as a background factor. So it actually lowers the expectation of what that student's score would be because they were transient in prior years. And it also takes into account a student's economically disadvantaged status and lowers the expectation by a point or 1.5 points. And if they have a specific type of disability, it gets reduced as well, which I think is where Chris was trying to go with a discussion among the panel or the board and panel about, does it lower expectations for a group of students? Is that one of it's kind of a loaded way of saying it, but and I'm the one who introduced that language, so I'm sorry, but is that something that we should correct for as we think about the next accountability system or the next growth measure? Or is that something that to some extent is acceptable in our accountability system? Or why is it acceptable in our accountability system?
So can I clean up
Yeah.
that a little bit? Because when you say lower expectations, those are buzzwords for people to get really, really upset about. And that is, I think what you're saying is that because there is an understanding that that student may perform not as well as other students because they've got more obstacles to overcome, that we now learn that that student is more likely than not to not perform as well. The higher expectation should come from that is that we then need to lean in more as a state, as a system, than to help that child, because there probably is an expectation, given all of the obstacles, those added obstacles, that that child is at risk of not performing as well. And therefore, what we need to do to ensure that that child is successful is we have to have greater expectations of the system, those people that are charged with helping that child, and that the system is the only thing that we can control. You might say, well, parents, parental control, and all those other things, but support systems. But those support systems that we're responsible for, that should inform us that, well, we're probably going to have a lot more work to do with that group of students. And to an earlier conversation that we're having offline, maybe we have to allocate more resources as a state. Then the state has to make a policy decision of, is that the right thing to do? Do we want to pour more money into that group of students, or do we want to pour more money in the students that are in the middle or maybe at the top? Where do we get the greatest bang for our buck? You know, that might sound coarse, but as a state, we always make these sort of value judgments as to how to allocate our resources. But I think it's an important part of the conversation is that we have a dollar, where we're going to spend that dollar and where do we get the greatest return on that investment. Is it with the students who are struggling the most, or those that are in the middle, or those that are in the top? And I think that's the exercise that we're going to go through the remainder of this Bessie, a month or two, and then we're going to pick up with next Bessie as we take on the accountability system, which is definitely going to be a big part of what will be discussed next year, both at Bessie and both at the legislature. So let's continue to tee it up now.
So I'd like to argue that accountability systems can do three things. I'm going to come back to this question with this framework. I have a sense of humility for what accountability can't do, but I think it can do three things. I think it can incent, so it can say what the focus is. So we've talked about some examples of that. You got students who are in, say, the lowest quartile. We want to incent focus on those students. We want more students to take advanced courses, put something in the model that rewards advanced courses. So number one, it can incent. Number two, it can monitor. It's not great at providing student level feedback, but it's good at providing group and school level feedback to monitor progress. So that's thing number two. And thing number three is it can help deploy supports. And I think that was what Mr. Castillo was talking about. This idea that if you can tell me where the schools or the groups most urgently in need of support are, then I've got a more strategic way now to deploy those supports, and then go back to the monitoring and the incent function. So I think those three things. And I like to put those three things to the test with questions like the background factors. How do the background factors support or inhibit those three purposes? I think I can make an argument, colleagues, that we inhibit some of those purposes with all of those background factors, because we're masking some of the things that we may want to detect. Now, again, that's a contentious statement, and I'm not trying to put my thumb too much on the scale, but I just want to invite conversation from the board or from the panel about how that stacks up. If you think that framing is at all useful, how decisions like background factors measures up against that framing.
Well,
Chris, can you define background factors for me so we're clear?
The background factors that Louisiana uses in the VAM are attendance, suspension, mobility, gifted, 504, special ed, economically disadvantaged, and English language learner.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Mr. Castillo?
I would just say, Chris, you're just spot on, I think. And I know it's contentious, but I think you're right. I think, we're having a conversation earlier that someone who I met 4 years ago who said, look, I was one of the original architects behind the state accountability system years ago. And when we initially created it, it was designed not to have letter grades and use them in the way that we're doing it now, but rather to inform the state on when we have challenges and how to deploy resources. And if you mask those challenges in areas where we're deficient, then we don't know how to deploy resources. Great point, arguably contentious, but we're balancing that with those who are working so hard to overcome those barriers. We seem to be suggesting to them when we report the data on how a student or a school, and by extension teachers, are performing, it creates the other problem of how do we continue to have resources? Because if by indicating the results, by telling someone what their letter grade is or their performance score, they choose then not to be a part of that system anymore. That is, they leave, teachers, families, and it just is a reality. I know as a young family, when my wife and I had our first child, we looked at school districts, how they're performing and where we're going to live. We're a young couple about to have a child, and we need to go and decide where to move. And so we, an up and coming middle class family, we choose to go and spend our resources and our talents where there is a school district that's already successful. So you got all those things to take into consideration. But Chris, to your point, I think it's a very good point. If what we truly are doing is we're being genuine, that if we're transparent, we know that there's a problem, and here's what we do to solve it. It's just that we have this very other complicated problem of it also creates a disincentive for folks to further invest in schools and school systems that may be underperforming. But it's a great point. I don't know how we solve for it because you got those sort of two competing issues.
Dr. Davis?
Yeah. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like if we took our background characteristics that you're asking about out of our accountability model, right, it would be just as easy to tell which of the schools we have that are educating predominantly low-income kids, because our LEAP scores are almost perfectly correlated with free and reduced lunch status, right? I mean, isn't it, last time I looked, it was like 0.9 something?
Your correlation on LEAP is accurate.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's high.
Mhm.
As far as if you remove the demographic factors from the VAM
Right.
model and make it a SGP or some other thing, it would only be correlated with those categories if we were not serving those categories as well as other categories of students. So basically, you're removing those categories. So if you used to reduce the expectation by 1.5 points, now you're saying that the student needs to get 1.5 points higher. So you're lowering where that kid falls in the percentiles. So the only way that the growth measure is going to be correlated is if we are indeed serving that student population worse than the overall population. I don't know if that made any sense, or if a member of the panel can explain it better than I did.
I like to think of it with respect to a specific factor to maybe pull out, like to put a sharper point on this. So let's take something like attendance. So I take the point, it's a good one, that there is a high correlation of all of these factors, and certainly the high correlation for prior performance and all of these factors. But let's imagine two schools that have the same prior performance, but one has a higher attendance rate than the other. Presumably, if attendance and performance are positively correlated, a lower attendance rate would set a lower growth target. And so you could have different scores, and those two schools would have the same overall growth outcomes because the model's adjusting for that. But maybe the school with the lower attendance, that was worth detecting, and that was worth deploying some supports to address. So that's the kind of thing that's the kind of conversation I would just invite us to think about.
It sounds like where you're going, Chris, is do we have enough resolution in the system to identify where our gaps are? And then once you can identify your gaps, you know where to put specific resources. Is that fair?
I think so. I follow your point. I think so. But again, I recognize this is a policy decision, and I really want to honor the policy perspectives from the board.
Watching our time, just want to see where you want to go from here, Chris.
Well, since we seem to have a natural pause here, maybe I'll show the panel and the board the other two categories, and let's elicit some reflections there. I do think practical considerations are important to put on the table as well. And some of this has come up through our conversation already. And we talked about some of these trade-offs. One is, to what extent is the model easy to understand? More simple models are easier to understand and apply, but too much emphasis on simplicity could work against other priorities. We talked about that when we were exploring these state illustrations by saying, value tables in general are a little more simple to describe than regression-based methods, but they have some trade-offs and that they can be coarse. And I'll just leave it at that. So, because there could be other examples. To what extent can the model be implemented? So does it require resources to stand up the model, additional personnel, funds? That's something that every state I work with takes into close consideration when they evaluate and make decisions about growth. And then the third is, to what extent is the model transparent and configurable? Some states I work with are very clear that the model has to be open access, that it can be configured, it can be replicated. There are some states that use proprietary solutions that are provided by a commercial provider. And those aren't configurable, and they aren't able to be replicated without that provider. So those are some practical considerations I wanted to put on the table, and I'll pause here to see if this inspires any reflections from the panel and the board.
On the second bullet, the question I have is, if we look at the Mississippi model, what's in place today, they obviously transitioned from something else to the current model. And so there seems to be a lot of interest on our group here with regard to the Mississippi model, given the demographics are so similar. Does anybody have any experience with the background there? You know, what were they using prior, and what all was involved in that transition to their current model?
You know, they were an SGP state before they were a value table state. I don't know much about implementation. I would say transition tables or value tables are among the more straightforward to implement. So I'd say if there's a continuum from hard to stand up to easier to stand up, value tables are easier to stand up.
Yeah, I'm really looking more for logistics. So, you know, if I'm a school district, and I've got to transition from, you know, base case to something different here that might be proposed, and I use Mississippi as an example, then is that a 2-year process? Is that a 5-year process? Do I need a whole new software system? You know, what are we talking about?
The impact would be on the state, not on the individual school systems. As far as doing the calculations and those types of things would be done at the state level.
Okay,
And
so
Thomas,
at the district
not
level.
only is
Go
it just
ahead.
a,
Go ahead, Christy. I'm sorry.
not only is it just a state burden, but transitioning from the VAM and the SGPs currently in use, or the VAM with the percentiles, to a transition table. The transition table can actually be done and replicated by districts, so they can do back of the envelope calculations to see where they're going to land. They currently cannot replicate or use or do the current base case model that you have in place. So it offers, maybe that's skipping into the transparent part, but it is something that they can more easily, it is something they can do. Before they can't, right now they can't replicate your growth model. And it, you know, much easier, faster calculation.
Okay, so I want to see if we can close the loop on that one. If let's take a case where there was interest on the board to move towards a Mississippi model, and we're looking at the base case today. I think what I heard was there would be little change in logistics, day-to-day operations and so forth at the district level. It would be more so at the state level. So if that is accurate, then I'm trying to understand how significant that change will be at the state level. What are we talking about with regard to timeline, financial resources, human resources, et cetera, et cetera. And again, going back to the Mississippi model and what they did there, we can leverage that experience. That would be helpful as well.
Chris, it would be helpful to be able to answer that question for Mr. Morris, to kind of look at what the questions that we would need to answer in order to adopt something like Mississippi's model. Like, what would we need to look at to determine how are we setting, you know, cut point 1? Are we, how do we think about, do we divide that into 2? Do we not divide it? Do we divide it into 3? What are those types of questions and data points that we should look at to inform that? I think that would help us get to resolution on that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I favor, rather than calling it like Mississippi model, just say like for transition tables, for that class of model, let's talk about, and then maybe this is something we can follow up on future meetings. What are the implementation steps that we think are most prominent for each of the model classes? Greg, you've had your hand up, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to add on 2 things now. I originally had one in mind, but I'll go with both. The first thing is, regardless of what model you transition to, if there is some change takes place, I'd strongly recommend you do the simulations behind the scenes to see what the likely effects of that are going to be with real historical data from your state. I think it makes a lot of sense to know what the results are likely to be. So that kind of research should be built into whatever path forward takes place. The second thing was I want to leap right into that transparency issue and just say, just really putting it coarsely, I mean, any accountability system is intended to incentivize some sort of behavior, to get people to do things or to behave differently. And so I think that transparency is a really key criterion. People ought to be able to see how that behavior is being rewarded in terms of the model. And they, like Christy was saying, they ought to be able to do the back of the envelope sort of calculation to see what's going to happen. But more than that, I would I would encourage sort of parsimony in the model. I've seen some really bad models, and bad's not the right word, but very complicated models where 2.5%, is allocated to this, chronic absenteeism. 1.5% is allocated to parental involvement. 5% to this, and the more of those things you have in there, it becomes almost impossible for anyone to align their course of action in such a way to take advantage of what's in the model. I mean, you just don't know what to do, or any individual element is so small that focusing on that element makes largely no difference. So one of the beauties of what we saw Chris show earlier was that some of the models had just a few things, ELA math growth and ELA math status, or similar. And so I think that's real easy for people to align to and to know where to put their emphasis. I don't know what those small number of elements should be. That's a policymaker's prerogative. But I would say that the smaller number of elements, the more likely you are to accomplish what you're trying to get out of an accountability system.
That's helpful.
I heard keep it as simple. I heard keep it simple. Mr. Castillo?
Over the last several years, one of the things I heard from system leaders and school leaders is they would say, look, we don't really care what you do. Can you just stick with whatever it is that you've created? Because the biggest challenge that we have is figuring out the accountability system. It takes a degree in something hyper technical to figure it out. And by the time we figure it out, it's changed. And it takes us so long to figure out technically how it works that creates a problem. And it may go back to the point about keeping it simple, but one of the challenges is the technical side of it. Just takes us so long to figure out what it is, and then to master the system to start to get some measurable results. So I'll just throw that out because I heard it so much, particularly the last time I ran, and then most recently when I ran again, where I'm constantly talking to folks and getting their feedback. Is one of those refrains that I heard most often, and that is keep it simple, stop changing it, and please choose a model and don't change it every few years because it makes it so difficult on the rest of us out here.
A lot of consensus there. I think if we understand it, then we know how better to respond. We understand better what the expectations are. Maybe it's easier to maintain. A lot of good points there.
This is helpful conversation. So I'm hearing stability. I'm hearing streamline to the extent practicable. And I heard at least one comment about supporting transparency. So that's
Well, I did hear a comment too about simulations. I don't know that we've talked about that. So if we're going forward and there's some interest in the board to pursue a particular type model in order to run simulations, can somebody talk me through that? How does that work? Do you borrow somebody else's simulation and you input your student data, or how does that work?
I can help a little bit. We need to know what the specifications are. So if we know the cut points that we want to do, we can run it through Louisiana's, we can run the data, but we need to know, are we awarding points when somebody moves from the bottom half of one to the top half of one? And that gets to the questions around what do we need to know about our model, our state, and that model to be able to decide where those cut points are.
Okay, so maybe what I'm hearing then is that we could potentially get a model, let's just say from Mississippi, but then we would have to customize the appropriate parameters, and before we could input our student population.
That's right.
Okay,
And I think Chris suggested that we could go through that in the next meeting to kind of get to a place where we could identify the analysis needed to do something like a transition table model or a straight SGP model or a whatever the other models were that he suggested today.
and any idea how long it takes to do that? To gather the information, set the parameters, and run the model?
I think one of the things that we need in order to do that is a set of values that we're kind of struggling to get to on what are we trying to measure in our growth model. Are we trying to measure growth to absolute proficiency? Are we trying to measure some other normative measure? And how long is too long for a student to sit in one achievement level or not?
Okay, so then if we go back to your previous question, if there was interest here at the board to run a simulation, let's just say for the Mississippi model, then could you guys help us out with the parameters that we would need to populate so that we could do that? I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I do think so. Here's my advice on this, and I'll be specific. I think some low-hanging fruit is let's run the current VAM without the background characteristics. I think that's one enticing analysis to run. And by the way, that's going to be a good proxy to an SGP. I don't suggest you run SGPs as well. That's going to be a heavier lift because you got to use the R package and it's going to take some training. I would do VAM without the background factors, see what that does. And then I think we could pick a value table specification. We could take a common model like in Mississippi or Florida, do an initial run, and then look at the results, and we could have some conversations about what you'd want to tweak based on what you've seen. So it's almost a little bit like do a run based on some set of default parameters. Let's inspect it and say, I'm surprised by this. I want to inquire about this more. And then we could talk about what bells and levers to pull. The thing that'll make this more feasible, and I'm imagining Thomas is going to be in your shop doing it, so you can say, it sounds good for me to promise lots of work from your team. But just getting the scope down. We can't do it in all grades for all years. So I think we just got to pick I don't know, grade 5, grade 8 math, something like that. That's what's going to make it easy to do in a shorter amount of time. So that's my perspective about all this.
That sounds good. Question though, you said run the model without the backgrounds. Does that mean not to run step 2 and to run everybody in step 1? Can you provide a little bit more clarity there?
He's saying set the percentiles based off of their expected score without removing points based off their characteristics. So if their expected score was a 725 and we had subtracted 2 points because of something, we would then say their expected score was 727 to determine the residual.
Right. But I thought all that was in step 2 when you're comparing them against their peers, right? And the way you distinguish their peers is with a particular background characteristic they have in common.
What Chris is saying is the only background characteristic that you would use is their previous score.
That's correct.
Okay, so you would compare the peers, you would compare the students relative to their peers with comparative scores.
But not based off of other demographic factors.
Okay, so there would be some regression analysis, I guess, with regard to their scores.
Yes.
Okay, so you're still running step 2, but it's just with basically one consideration.
That's right.
One common consideration.
And this would be similar to what Iowa does, but not exactly, because Iowa has the 95% that they work on, or Illinois. I don't remember which state it was. It started with an I.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
So we can, I can work with Thomas and his team offline a little bit to see if we can either, I don't want to promise anything we can't deliver, but to either more fully specify or even with the possibility of getting some initial insights from the data for our next meeting.
Chris, for those, let's say you end up running 2 simulations or whoever's doing it. Yeah, I think it would be important then to think about how you're looking at, because presumably you're going to compare the existing model to the simpler model. And I think it would be important to think about which groups you're going to be comparing. One obviously is how do schools change under those 2 conditions, but also you might do it by how scores for certain subgroups of students are shifting as well. And of course, we can predict that there's going to be substantial shifts for some of those subgroups that are taken out of the model. And I think that'll help highlight or further the discussion about having the same expectations for everybody and what that means.
I think that's good advice, or even if this is a sort of friendly addition to what you're saying, schools with different characteristics or concentrations of these student groups.
Yeah, you could do it that way too. Yeah, I'm just suggesting like I know you are, so I'm just putting on the record. Like, be thoughtful up front about what comparisons we want to be looking at to inform how this influences the outcomes.
Really good advice.
So, Chris, we do have one comment card we want to honor from the public. We got about 10 minutes left. I think maybe you might want to give us a little bit of a summary here with regard to wrapping up today, and then expectations for I think what's our last meeting with this group, and then we could go to public comment.
Absolutely. So I think, it's daunting to think that we just have one more meeting. So I think one of the tasks before me is, and I'm glad I have my colleague Chris Brandt here, is to write up. I think we need some kind of capstone document that really takes us through the things we've talked about, the principles and priorities that have emerged, and really spend time in our last meeting letting the panel inspect that and improve that, particularly if we're going to say this is the result of our collective discussion. I think we need to put together some very clear documentation and let the panel react to that and improve it. The other big idea I hear coming from this is we need to prioritize simulations, and I suggested a framing for that we could run a model without background factors. We could run at least one instantiation of a value table model. If we constrain the scope, then maybe that'll be feasible by our next meeting, which I think is in late November. There are a number of comments that were made about policy priorities. Frankly, I don't know that we found a clear through line, but I heard some themes here about both valuing norm reference and growth to standard. Frankly, there seemed to be more voices in support of growth to standard type approaches, but I didn't hear an abandonment of norm reference. I heard a number of comments supporting more streamlined or simple models. So I think that's something that we have to make sure is prominent in our documentation. And again, I'll just have to get with my colleague Chris and look at the full set of notes, and we'll write this out for everybody's review for November. But those 2 things really strike me as the primary to-do items after today.
Chris, if I could add one thing, not to make it too much more complicated for Thomas and his team, but the current approach without the conditioning variables is nice to run that in the simulation, as is sort of a value table approach. But value table approaches only instantiate one set of values. So I think you need sort of 2 comparison value table approaches. So you can see one that weights more the growth to standard perhaps, and one that weights more normative progress. If you just make one table that sort of cuts it down the middle, you're not going to really see the distinction between what could be 2 very different approaches. So I'm arguing for 3 so that it's a little sharper distinction.
That's fair. Or maybe one that values progress below proficiency more or something. So yeah, I'm with you. And if nothing else, even if we don't say that one of those two approaches was the gold standard, and it's unlikely that we would, we'd at least see how much variation you get from these distinguishing decisions, which itself is an insight worth arriving.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, now where did we land on this particular student population that we're going to use for input?
I believe we're going to use, we'll probably use all of them for the value table if I had to guess. But to do the value added without the demographic background, we would just grab 2 grades. I'm not sure which 2, maybe 1. It would really depend on how long it's going to take us to rerun it. I'll have to get with the team on that. So we'll probably do 1 grade.
Okay, everybody on the panel aligned with that? Heads nodding. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, anything else, or should we go to a public comment now? We're good? All right, I have one
want to hear
public comment
public
card
comment.
here. I have one public comment here. It's Dr. Angela Beck. She wishes to speak, and it's information only. Dr. Beck, thank you for joining us today. If you would identify yourself for the record, and love to hear your comments.
I am Dr. Angela Beck. I am coming here to speak on behalf of myself, not as a representative of charters, not as a representative of a specific school, but as an educator of 27 years. I don't have a subject matter expert identification in test design and assessment, so I'm so glad that you have brought in a panel to do the work. I do have a subject matter expert label as an educational researcher. And I care about our state. I care about our kids. And I've been digging and digging and digging probably just as much as you have to see how, like, what can we do as schools? What can we do as a state? How do we make this better? And that's why I continue to show up here every meeting just about, because I feel like I'm in this with you guys, right? It takes a team. As a part of the digging, and I appreciate the value conversation because we've had this a lot of, conversation a lot of times is like, where do we foresee our 12th grade kids? Like, what do we want them to look like when they graduate our schools? And we need to backwards map that thought process, right? And the one way we can do this is through our assessment system, right? How do we know our kids are ready for the real world or to be globally competitive, right? And it's through this accountability system. So we do need to get something in place. And I agree, Preston, where you're like, hey, like, let's get something in place and not keep finagling with things or moving it around. Let's give the opportunity for schools to really spend some time with this accountability system. And it needs to be fair in a way that it truly reflects the performance of students, right? All students, you're high, you're medium, you're low. I 100% agree with that. If you will indulge me for a second, I do have a copy of like just 2 samples that I want to walk you through as like a teacher. I'm not making judgments on this sample at all. You can draw your own conclusions, but I want to talk through what information I get as a teacher when I look at certain questions and the wraparound services that, we're talking about in Mississippi, right? How do we know what supports to bring to the table based off of the questions we are asking to kids? And I think that is a very, very, very important question. And that's something like we need to put to the forefront as we're making these decisions and valuing this process. So I don't want to force this on you guys. If you want a copy to take a look at, I got 4.
We're all here to learn, Dr. Beck.
Okay.
Go for it.
So I took time, what I have access to, which is anybody can grab this information. It's found publicly on websites. This first page is just math, 3rd grade, LEAP release question 1, and then math practice test for Mississippi, which I'm glad we've been talking about a lot because I do feel like we're probably most closely aligned with that state. And what information do we gain from these type of questions that we ask kids? Let's just go with the thought process that these are the only two questions that kids will see on a test, or they only see one of these, right, on a test with perimeter. Okay. As a math teacher, this first part A,
So Dr. Beck, if you
Yeah.
bear with me.
Yeah.
So for our subject matter experts who don't have the hard copy
yeah,
reference,
sorry.
just want to help them out here. What we're looking at is Louisiana elite third grade math problem and a Mississippi grade math problem, which I'm assuming are comparable. And I think where Dr. Beck is taking us is the difference in the two tests, and assuming we have the same student population. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
And again, I'm not making judgment on what's right and wrong. That's not for me to judge. I'm not an expert in this. I'm just coming here to say, here's the information I would glean from these problems here. And with the part A portion, students need to know to do the following. They need to know how to double 21. They need to know to subtract that information from the overall perimeter, which is 122. Then they need to find that answer and divide it by 2 in order to get a response. And then they have to, if it's a hard copy test, they have to know to bubble it in properly. As a teacher, I don't know clearly if my kids truly understand perimeter. This is a very advanced question. This is something I would expect my mastery and advanced students to get right. But if this is the only question they would see on a test, for example, and again, I don't have access to the real test, I don't design it. I wouldn't know as a state, or I wouldn't know as a teacher myself, what is the issue the kid is having based off of their response. The only one I would really know based on a couple of responses, maybe if they put 80, that means they actually know perimeter, but they didn't divide it to get one of the individual sides of what the question's asking. And I'm like, okay, you've got perimeter. I know you got this, right? Instead of putting 40. When I look at Mississippi's like figure here, I'm very clear on like, does this kid know perimeter or not? Because they have to figure out which one's going to give them 30, period. And you have to know to add all the sides. It's not a guessing game. They're not making them fill something. And I know, hey, they know perimeter. They know the definition. When they get to algebra and they start doing pre-calculus and they can apply this later in life. They have this skill as a third grader right on, right? And so if let's just say 80% of my students didn't get this right, I could perform the wraparound services to this standard and make sure that they're getting what they need, because I have hardcore identified that the kids don't know this.
So what I'm getting from that is you're looking at two different states. You're looking at the same grade level, but one problem obviously has more concepts embedded in it than the other. And because there are more concepts embedded in it, then we're trying to help the student. How do we understand which concept they missed?
Yes.
So therefore, what kind of supports do we need to help them close the gap on that particular concept?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
And it's the same thing I gave you. Sorry, it's kind of small. I try to include, it's not the full prompt, obviously. But LEAP for English. And again, this is Linda, this is maybe more your area of expertise. I have a math degree, so that's why I felt comfortable on page 1. But I tried to match up here too. If you put the two side by side, right? They both ask a definition question, like, what is this term in the story, right? How are you identifying? What context clues are you using? So what I can say with Mississippi, when I look at that one, they're asking about spectacles, right? The pictures aligning to this question, and they even say in the paragraph that there's no reason why horses shouldn't wear glasses. If I can clearly articulate, can a kid read? By them not being, if they miss this question, they're struggling. They're not reading at all. We need to give a lot, probably go back to the basics with the kids of like sight words and all these things. It gives me a lot of information. Now, this seems very low level. I understand. And your test should assess various levels of kids. But at the end of the day, I know if they missed this question,
Right.
we've got a problem. And so I can deploy my wraparound services
Right. So do we,
Yeah.
basically, do we have the appropriate diagnostics in place, right, to go work the problems? Is that what I'm hearing?
Is our test, and again, I don't have access to it. I don't design it, but I'm hypothetically saying if this part A, part B of like perimeter, for example, is the only question we have on the test with perimeter, how do we truly know if the kid gets perimeter? Because they could be having some issues in other areas.
Right. So I think those are great points. I think testing is a little bit out of scope for our panel of experts, but it's something that we could certainly leverage from them. But I think Mr. Lambert has a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I can have our math team take a look at the math question. The LEAP test is designed to determine which achievement level the student is sitting in. They might see an advanced or a mastery question about perimeter, but they might see a basic or an approaching basic question about another math concept. So just because you find a perimeter example in one state's release test items and a perimeter example in another, doesn't mean that they are seeking to reach the same depth of knowledge or the same standard exactly. So I would just offer that most states don't have enough release test items out, including Louisiana. I wish that we had a lot more, but it's really hard to release items.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I said I have no judgment. I mean, both questions are valid for what they're trying to serve, right? But when we're talking about our values of our accountability system, I think we need to keep that in mind as well, because one of your biggest questions, Mr. Morris, was how do we assess kids maybe who aren't quite on grade level? You notice this question is less text heavy. And if they are sitting in class and know just the basics of addition and how to solve it, they will get this right. If they don't, we got a bigger problem, right? Than what we know.
Well, I think you did really a great job of providing an example of one of the major takeaways today, which was, our ability to identify where the gaps are and then provide the appropriate support services to close those gaps. So really appreciate your comments and always appreciate your attendance, Dr. Begg. Thank you so much.
Question.
Mr. Garvey.
Just to make sure I'm understanding Thomas right. If I understand you right, you're saying Louisiana's test has both types of these questions, both the hard question with multiple steps and the more simple question with one step only. And it's judging kids on several levels by using several different types of questions.
I don't know the third grade math test items that well. I think that most of them are two-step problems, but they might be easier two-step problems than the one that is presented here.
Most of them?
Oh,
Does that
not
mean
most.
that
Not-
some of them are also one-step problems?
I don't believe that we have any one-step problems like the one that you showed.
No. And here's the other
Okay.
thing I'm going to point out too, is that our third through eighth, you see this AB for English, other than the writing sections, this is how our test is designed. It is state the answer, give evidence. And if you don't get part A right, which rightfully so, you can't get B right. But if you look at Mississippi's test design, they have other questions straight up, like the spectacle question doesn't have a part B to it. It just is, right? And it gives that student the opportunity to answer that correctly, right? Without having to say, oh, here's my evidence behind this, right? Which they may not be as developed in that area. But we know, hey, at least they have the basics. They're reading, they can use context clues, and they can use all the resources they have in order to answer that question. And I have to believe in some way, if we're talking about how Mississippi's moving up, let's just hypothetically say they have more questions that are more one step than two step, right? They're like, I think it is the key, because you're able to wrap around the services and identify the issues. And it's not as much of I got you. That is not an I got you question. If you look at it, it's something like, we know our kids are going to do well. They're reading. We know they can go to wherever and read at least a paragraph and then know how to solve for vocabulary maybe they're struggling with, right? We know they can read through things and identify that.
Okay,
So, Chris, how big of an ask is it to come back with this for some sort of insight on the difference between Mississippi testing, that's part of the puzzle, right? And Louisiana test that's in place today. Is that a whole nother project for first quarter next year? Or is that something that this group can come back to us with some preliminary comments? Or is there really that big of a difference between the two tests or the two states?
I think really to honor the topic, it really is more substantial than less. So probably something that we could converse offline about if you like, sir.
Follow up.
I didn't get that. I'm sorry. Can you clarify that?
I think it's substantial to really honor the range of this topic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Garvey?
Yeah, if I'm remembering right, I think I've heard Thomas say several times over the past 2 years that one of the problems, and maybe problem is the wrong word, but one of the problems we have with the Louisiana Tech test is a lack of granularity, particularly at the low end. And this seems like a perfect example if I'm understanding the situation right. Am I understanding it right? And have you been thinking about this issue? And I thought you were, and focusing on how do we fix it, kind of along the lines of what Ms. Beck is talking about.
Our test blueprint doesn't have enough items at the bottom end of the scale to get to a place where our standard error is smaller. That does not change the fact that a student who is in the unsatisfactory achievement level legitimately is unable to do the items above the unsatisfactory achievement level. The test doesn't have as many easy items as perhaps Mississippi's does, but it does have items on it that will help us determine that a student is in that unsatisfactory category or they're in the approaching basic category. So it's a question of, do we have enough items to say that this student's within 10 points of what the score we're giving them is, or are they within 15, or were they within 20? So there are easier items. We could add more if we wanted to decrease that error that we looked at in the last meeting. But at this point, we can say with certainty near certainty that a student who scores approaching basic is far below basic.
So on that one, Mr. Lambert, a couple of points. So number one, what I'm hearing is that the system that's in place today is we can put the student in the right category. We may not have the best resolution within that category. Is that fair?
And some categories we can say top half, bottom half very, very clearly. Some categories, the standard error is very large, which is why I think sometimes you see that it's not, you move a half a category in states with value tables, and instead you have to move a whole category because of the margin of error that's in there.
Okay, my second point, and I think my last one for the day, when we first started this work, and I really, really appreciate the work from this panel, by the way, there was a conversation early on that's been ongoing about the student population, and so much of that student population is not at grade level. And the current test, as I understand it, evaluates progress at the grade level. So are we actually identifying and giving appropriate credit for growth from some lower grade level to the current grade level? Or are we addressing that today? There seems to be a lot of question there. And if not, how do we close that gap? I think that one was addressed to our subject matter experts.
Is the question about getting more fine-grained information and details of the assessment, is that the core issue we're talking about?
I don't know that. I think it's partly a test question. I think it's partly an assessment question, but it's a problem.
Yeah,
that we need to address, again, because we go back to the specific student population that we have. We've heard all these correlations to Mississippi. They've obviously addressed the same, fundamental issue. But I don't know what the answer was there. I don't know what the answer is here, but the same question keeps popping up. And that is that so much of our student population is not at grade level. We've got people that are working in these really challenging environments. They're making progress. There seems to be some question about whether or not the progress they're making is identified and they're getting credit for that progress so that we can continue to get people to do that work.
I feel like there's a couple of issues on the table, reflecting on Dr. Beck's remarks. I think the primary emphasis is on what I would call instructional utility or sensitivity of items. I feel like a related issue is whether we're getting the sensitivity and precision across the full range of the scale, which I know is something that in my work with the Louisiana Technical Advisory Committee has been a topic that has been addressed and is continuing to be addressed, and there's work underway to do that. And that obviously will connect to our ability to describe progress with whatever growth model, whether it's some continuation of the current value-added model or a transition to another model with more precision across the full range. So there is, I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, and that's why it's been an ongoing process, but it requires putting, having more items at the bank, creating more information in across the range of the test, but doing so in a way that doesn't disturb the comparability overall from year to year, which is a really important requirement, and not, so it's a needle to thread. And I know that it's work that's ongoing.
Chris, can I offer just a couple real quick thoughts, because I hope that some folks will leave with this in mind as we think about values going forward.
Of course.
I think a lot about when kids are behind, what's it going to take to get them to grade level? And the best example that I can give is if you're trying to get on a train and that train is going away from you at 5 miles an hour and you can run at 5 miles an hour, and one kid starts right by the train. The train's going, they're going, they grab the train and they get on it. What if somebody can only go 1 mile an hour or 1.5 miles an hour and they started 20 feet back, 40 feet back, 100 feet back? In order to get someone to the train, they're going to have to move faster in order to get there. So the question that we have to answer when we think about what is our growth measure trying to do is, do we want the kid to get on the train? Do we want the kid to almost get on the train? Do we want the kid to get to the same distance they were from the train previously? And it's a really hard thing to answer because there are so many confounding factors with it. And when you look at all of the different growth models, part of the value is, do you want to make sure that kids are moving adequately to get to the train? And there are some of them that don't assure that, and there are some of them that do. And it's really hard to think about, for me, students moving toward the train but never getting on it, and us thinking that that's enough. So I really sit with that a lot, because it is harder to get on the train if you're starting behind, but it's also hard for me to think about giving a school an A for that if the student is still just as far away from the train at the end. So I hoped that we would have gotten a little bit farther in the values to get us to a place where we could design some of these over the next couple weeks. But I think Chris and I are going to get together and work on that, Mr. Castillo.
Only because I can't resist.
Yeah.
But if you can get the student to run 5 miles per hour,
yeah,
which is what was necessary to be able to get on the train in the first place, have you succeeded? In other words, how do you measure success? Which I think is part of what you're getting at.
Yeah.
But part of it is just that 5 miles per hour, and that is, you brought that student here to that level, and how do you celebrate that?
Yeah.
Or how do you acknowledge that?
Yeah.
Can I just make one attitude to that? Just so you know, these questions you're looking at are third grade standards. So whether the kid gets the second, the Mississippi question right, they're meeting that grade level standard. They're saying, I know perimeter, which is what the objective of that standard is. So I want to make sure we're not confusing things, because if the kid doesn't get that question right, then they're not on grade level. We do know that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Beck. All right. Chris, any closing comments from the panel before we adjourn for the evening on a Friday afternoon?
Yes, sir. Thank you for everybody's time today. So it was a great meeting.
Thank you guys so much. I hope you all have a great weekend. Go Tigers.
All right, I'm gonna hit you with a go dogs one of these days when you say that, Mr. Morris.
All right, let's talk about SEC championship. Meeting
I have to
adjourned.
chime in with Golden Knolls. I mean, come on.
Oh,
Yeah.
all
Okay.
right. All right, all right, all right.
Good
Go
game,
SEC.
good game for LSU this weekend. I'll be thinking about you all.
All right, we're adjourned here. Thank you, guys.